Everyone inside the dojo burst out laughing the moment they saw her walk through the door. A black woman stepped into the training hall wearing plain clothes, no patches, no belt, no one beside her, just a quiet woman carrying a small gym bag like she had wandered into the wrong building entirely. The most famous black belt instructor in the entire city looked her over from head to toe and smirked at his students before he even said a word to her. He asked if she wanted to try a little friendly match, just for fun, nothing serious, and the crowd around him immediately erupted into laughter and cheering, already certain of how this would end. They assumed she would be on the floor within seconds, embarrassed and out of breath, a funny story they would tell for weeks at the gym and online afterward. Nobody in that room had any idea that the quiet woman standing in front of them had once gone undefeated for more than a decade, holding titles that even legends of the sport spoke of, with quiet, reluctant respect. And in just a few minutes, that same dojo, filled with laughter and mockery, was about to fall completely silent, and nothing about that evening would ever be forgotten by anyone who witnessed it. Her name was Maya Johnson, 35 years old, and she had just moved to the city for a new job that promised a fresh start after years of deliberately staying out of the public eye. She spent her days working long hours in a quiet office downtown, and in the evenings she wanted nothing more than a place to stay active, somewhere to move her body and clear her mind without anyone asking questions about her past or her name. The city was unfamiliar to her, full of strangers and new streets, and she had spent the first few weeks simply learning her way around before allowing herself the small luxury of searching for a gym. While walking home from a late dinner one evening, she passed by the most well-known martial arts academy in town, a gleaming building with trophies displayed proudly in the front windows, and banners announcing championships won by the local hero who ran the place. The academy belonged to Derek Coleman, a black belt instructor who had won the state title more times than most people could count on both hands, a man whose photograph hung near the entrance, with his arms crossed and his chin lifted in practiced pride. Inside, the walls were lined with framed certificates, newspaper clippings, and group photographs from tournaments, where Derek stood front and center, always smiling for the cameras, always positioned at the heart of every celebration. Students who trained under him spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and quiet fear, aware that his praise could turn into criticism in an instant if anyone dared to outshine him during a class. He had built his reputation carefully over many years, cultivating an image of dominance that few in the local martial arts community ever thought to question. Maya wore simple workout clothes that evening, nothing flashy, nothing that hinted at medals or certificates or championship belts, carefully packed away in boxes back home that she had not opened in years. A few students lounging near the entrance looked her up and down the second she walked in, exchanging glances and quiet smirks that made their assumptions painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. They decided almost instantly that she was just another curious visitor, someone who had wandered in out of boredom or mild curiosity, definitely not someone who belonged on their training floor among serious practitioners. Derek barely looked up from the students he was correcting near the center mat, sparing her only a brief, dismissive glance before returning his full attention to his own reflection in the mirrored wall behind him. When he finally turned to acknowledge her properly, his tone carried the kind of casual condescension typically reserved for people he assumed could never possibly challenge him in any meaningful way. He asked, with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, whether she had ever trained in martial arts before in her entire life, his voice loud enough for the nearby students to hear and snicker quietly among themselves. Maya only offered a small, calm smile in response, the kind of smile that revealed absolutely nothing about the years of discipline and sacrifice hidden carefully behind her quiet, steady eyes. That gentle, unreadable silence seemed to bother Derek more than any verbal answer ever could have, and something about her composure made him want to provoke a stronger reaction, any reaction at all that would confirm his assumptions about her. He wanted to perform for his students, to remind everyone watching exactly who ruled this dojo, and a stranger with no visible credentials seemed like the perfect prop for his next little display of dominance. He began asking her a string of questions, dripping with thinly veiled mockery, wondering aloud whether she even knew what a proper fighting stance looked like, or if she had simply walked in off the street, looking for some kind of attention. Maya remained polite through every single jab, answering softly, never raising her voice, never matching his rising energy with anything resembling defensiveness, irritation, or anger of her own. One of the younger students standing nearby, perhaps feeling a small flicker of sympathy for the quiet newcomer, suggested they simply offer her a free trial class instead of all the teasing and pointed questions. But that innocent suggestion sparked something entirely different in Derek's mind. An idea that made his smirk widen slowly into something far more theatrical and considerably less kind than before. He decided, right there in front of his entire class, that this stranger could become his evening's entertainment, a way to remind everyone gathered why he remained the undisputed king of this particular dojo. He proposed a friendly sparring match, framing it carefully as something casual and harmless, just for fun, nothing anyone in the room needed to take seriously or worry about afterward. The students around him cheered instantly, sensing the show that was about to unfold before their eyes, several of them already pulling out their phones to record whatever embarrassment was coming for the stranger. A few students even began placing playful bets among themselves under their breath, wagering how many seconds she might last before tapping out or simply walking away from the mat in defeat. Maya declined the offer once, then twice, her voice calm but firm, clearly uninterested in becoming anyone's spectacle for the evening's entertainment. But Derek kept pushing, needling her relentlessly with comments about nervousness, about excuses, about people who talked themselves out of challenges, because deep down, they were afraid of losing in front of a crowd of strangers. Other students joined in now, some laughing along with Derek, others simply watching with curious anticipation, wondering how this quiet, unassuming woman would eventually respond to the mounting pressure surrounding her. Maya finally looked around the dojo slowly, taking in the mirrors lining the walls, the worn mats beneath her feet, the eager and slightly cruel faces of students who had absolutely no idea what they were about to witness in the coming minutes. She asked him quietly, almost gently, if he was absolutely certain about this, her tone carrying a strange weight that nobody in the room, least of all Derek, was prepared to recognize or understand. Derek laughed off the question entirely, waving his hand dismissively as though her words carried no weight at all, completely blind to the subtle, almost imperceptible shift that had just occurred behind her calm expression. What none of them could see in that moment was the memory now rushing back into Maya's mind, pulling her thoughts toward a childhood that had shaped every quiet, measured movement she made and every careful word she chose to speak. She had grown up in a struggling neighborhood where money was tight and tempers were often shorter than anyone's patience allowed, a place where children learned to read danger long before they ever learned to properly read books in school. Maya had been bullied relentlessly as a child, mocked endlessly for her dark skin, her unusual height for her age, her quiet demeanor that many classmates mistook for weakness, rather than recognizing it as the calm discipline it would eventually become. Most days she walked home from school with her head down, absorbing insults thrown carelessly by classmates who never once considered the quiet storm slowly building inside her chest with each passing year. Her mother worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, leaving Maya alone for long stretches of time, learning early how to comfort herself and how to disappear quietly into the background of any room she entered. It was an old, weathered instructor named Walter Briggs who first noticed something different in her, a stillness in her eyes that suggested far more potential than anyone else around her had ever bothered to recognize or nurture. Walter ran a small community center program out of a cramped building that smelled permanently of old wood, sweat, and dust, offering free lessons to neighborhood kids who had nowhere else to channel their restless energy after school. He began teaching Maya at the age of 12, starting with the most basic stances imaginable, correcting her posture patiently over and over until her movements began to feel natural rather than forced. Maya threw herself into training with an intensity that startled even her own teacher, practicing for hours after school each day, refusing to stop even when her muscles screamed in protest against the relentless repetition. Walter recognized quickly that this was not simply a hobby for the quiet girl in front of him, but something closer to a calling, a way for her to finally channel years of buried frustration into something productive and powerful. She entered competition after competition over the following years, starting small at first, local tournaments held in school gymnasiums, where trophies were cheap plastic and the crowds were thin, restless, and largely uninterested in the outcome. Slowly, methodically, she began collecting national titles one after another, each victory adding another quiet layer of confidence to a girl who had once been mocked simply for existing too loudly in any given room. Walter traveled with her to every tournament he could afford, sitting quietly in the stands, offering brief words of encouragement before each match, and careful, honest feedback after every single one, regardless of the outcome. Their bond grew stronger with each passing year, built not on flashy promises of fame, but on a shared, quiet belief that discipline and patience would eventually outlast talent alone. Eventually, her talent and relentless dedication carried her onto the international stage, where she faced opponents trained by some of the most respected and feared coaches in the entire world, each match testing her further than the last had ever managed to. Her winning streak stretched on for more than 10 consecutive years, an unbroken chain of victories that left sports commentators struggling repeatedly to find new words capable of properly describing her sustained dominance. Within professional circles, her name became something close to legend, whispered with a careful mixture of admiration and disbelief by fighters who had personally felt the painful consequences of underestimating her inside the ring. Magazine covers featured her calm, focused expression. Journalists wrote lengthy profiles attempting to explain her seemingly impossible consistency, and young athletes across the country began naming her as their primary inspiration. But then, without warning, her mother passed away unexpectedly, and something inside Maya quietly broke in a way that no championship belt or trophy could ever hope to repair or properly replace. The grief arrived suddenly and overwhelmingly, swallowing whole the satisfaction she had once found in competition, replacing it instead with a heavy, persistent numbness that refused to lift, no matter how hard she trained. She walked away from the spotlight entirely after that, turning down lucrative interviews, ignoring sponsorship offers, disappearing almost completely from a world that had once celebrated her name proudly on banners and broadcasts spanning the entire globe. She moved through several cities quietly over the following years, picking up ordinary jobs that asked nothing extraordinary of her, blending seamlessly into ordinary lives until eventually she landed here, in this particular city, in front of this particular dojo, standing before this particular man who had absolutely no idea who he was actually speaking to. Nobody here knew her story. Nobody recognized her face from old magazine covers or grainy championship footage, and for the first time in many long years, that complete anonymity had felt like a strange, welcome kind of peace, rather than the heavy burden it once might have seemed. Maya blinked slowly, pulling herself back fully into the present moment, the noise of the dojo rushing back into her ears as Derek continued speaking nearby, completely unaware of the storm of memories that had just passed quietly behind her calm, unreadable eyes. Something in her gaze had changed now, subtle but absolutely unmistakable to anyone who knew her well enough to notice, a quiet readiness settling over her entire posture, like some internal switch had silently been flipped. The students gathered around the mats quickly, forming a loose, excited circle that buzzed with nervous anticipation, phones raised high, voices dropping into hushed whispers about what was about to happen between their instructor and this strange newcomer. Derek stepped onto the mat with theatrical flair, throwing a few sharp practice kicks into the empty air, drawing appreciative murmurs and scattered applause from students who had watched him perform this exact warm-up routine dozens of times before tonight. Maya simply walked to her designated side of the mat and stood there, completely still and unmoving, her posture relaxed in a way that several students immediately and confidently mistook for total ignorance rather than recognizing it as deliberate, practiced control. One student leaned toward his friend near the edge of the mat and whispered just loud enough for others to overhear that she did not even know how to stand properly, that she clearly had no real idea what she was about to walk into tonight. Derek overheard the comment drifting through the crowd and grew even more visibly confident, his chest puffing out slightly as he settled comfortably into his own practice stance. Eyes narrowing with theatrical focus for the phone cameras now pointed directly at him. A student volunteered eagerly to act as referee for the match, raising one hand high and announcing in a booming, dramatic voice that the contest was about to officially begin, drawing one final enthusiastic wave of cheers from the gathered crowd around the mat. The makeshift bell rang out sharply, a clear sound that cut through the noise and silenced the entire room for just a brief moment before everyone leaned forward eagerly to watch what would happen next. Derek lunged forward almost immediately, moving with the kind of practice speed that had won him trophy after trophy in regional tournaments over the years, certain that this opening strike alone would end things quickly and decisively. Maya shifted her weight just slightly, the smallest possible movement imaginable, and his strike sailed harmlessly through empty air, exactly where she had been standing, only a single heartbeat earlier. Derek stumbled forward awkwardly, completely missing his intended target, and the entire dojo gasped audibly at the sight of their celebrated champion overextending himself against someone they had all assumed would crumble instantly under pressure. He recovered his footing quickly, embarrassment flashing briefly across his reddening face, and launched another series of rapid attacks, faster this time, and noticeably more aggressive, determined to correct his earlier mistake in front of his own watching students. Maya avoided every single strike that came her way, her movements small and remarkably economical, never wasting unnecessary energy, never offering so much as a single counterattack in return for any of his efforts. She simply was not there whenever his hands or feet eventually arrived at their intended target, slipping past each attack like calm water, flowing effortlessly around stubborn stones sitting in a riverbed. Minutes passed this way steadily, Derek attacking relentlessly, while Maya did nothing but evade with quiet precision, and the crowd's earlier laughter slowly faded into a tense, uncertain silence that nobody present had truly expected to settle over the room so quickly. Derek's breathing grew noticeably heavier with each passing exchange, his attacks growing visibly sloppier and more desperate, frustration beginning to crack steadily through the polished, practiced confidence he had originally walked in with that evening. For the first time since this entire encounter had begun, an uncomfortable thought flickered uneasily through Derek's mind, an unwelcome realization, slowly dawning, that the woman standing calmly in front of him was nothing close to ordinary or inexperienced. Sweat began forming steadily along his hairline now, droplets sliding slowly down his temple, as his chest heaved with exertion that should never have accumulated this quickly against someone he had assumed was a complete beginner just minutes earlier. The students watching from the sidelines noticed his growing discomfort too, exchanging confused glances with one another, the earlier mocking laughter now replaced entirely by a thick, uneasy silence hanging over the entire training floor. Derek shifted his strategy entirely, pulling out his most advanced and impressive techniques, the very same moves that had won him championship after championship across the state, competitive circuit over many years of dedicated practice. Maya read each of his movements before they fully even formed, her eyes tracking subtle, almost invisible shifts in his shoulders and hips that telegraphed his exact intentions, long before his limbs ever actually moved toward her. It seemed almost as though she already knew precisely what he was about to attempt next, anticipating each individual attack with an effortless ease that made the entire surrounding room grow eerily and uncomfortably quiet. A few of the more experienced students, standing near the front of the crowd, exchanged worried, uncertain glances, recognizing something deeply and fundamentally wrong with the rhythm of this particular match that none of them quite had the words for yet. They had trained under Derek for years now, watching him dominate countless sparring sessions and tournaments, and had never once witnessed him look so completely outmatched, so thoroughly unable to land even a single meaningful strike against any opponent before tonight. Frustration finally cracked through Derek's carefully maintained composure entirely, his jaw tightening visibly, his movements growing increasingly reckless, as raw anger steadily replaced careful strategy in his desperate approach to each new exchange. The disciplined, confident instructor they had long admired and respected was slipping away in real time right before their eyes, replaced instead by something raw, frustrated, and increasingly desperate in front of an audience that had originally come expecting nothing more than an easy, entertaining show. Then, for the very first time since the match began, Maya moved forward instead of simply away, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion that none of the watching students fully registered until it had already happened right in front of them. It was only one single technique, executed with a precision and control that only comes from thousands upon thousands of hours of careful, dedicated repetition spread across an entire lifetime of training. Derek's feet left the mat entirely in that moment, his entire body staggering backwards several feet before he managed to catch his balance against the padded edge of the training area, his eyes now wide with genuine, undeniable shock. The entire dojo rose to its feet almost in unison at that exact moment, gasps, and excited murmurs rippling steadily through the crowd as phones shook slightly in trembling hands, still desperately trying to capture every second of this unexpected moment. Among the crowd of stunned students stood a man named Robert Hayes, a former professional competitor who had retired from the competitive circuit several years earlier and now simply enjoyed watching local matches purely for casual entertainment on his evenings off. He stared at Maya for an unusually long, fixed moment, his eyes narrowing steadily as something tugged persistently at the edges of his memory, a face that felt strangely, almost impossibly familiar to him, despite the unfamiliar setting. He pulled out his phone slowly, with hands that moved noticeably slower than his racing, suddenly urgent thoughts, fingers searching frantically through old saved articles and photographs from many years, spent closely following the professional sport. An old photograph eventually loaded onto his screen, slightly grainy and clearly dated, taken years earlier at a major international championship event that had once dominated headlines across the entire sporting world for weeks. Standing proudly on the highest podium in that old photograph, metal gleaming brightly under intense stadium lights, was unmistakably the very same woman now standing quietly and calmly on the training mat directly in front of him tonight. Robert's breath caught sharply in his throat as the scattered pieces finally clicked together all at once inside his mind, the realization hitting him suddenly with the force of an actual physical blow to his chest. He shouted her full name across the dojo, without even thinking twice about it, his voice cutting sharply through the lingering tension like a blade, declaring loudly, in complete disbelief, that the woman standing before all of them was none other than Maya Johnson. The entire room fell instantly into a silence so complete and total that the soft electric hum of the overhead fluorescent lights suddenly seemed almost deafeningly loud against the heavy stillness now gripping the entire space. Derek heard the name ripple steadily through the crowd standing behind him, heard it repeated again and again in hushed, disbelieving whispers, passing rapidly from one student to the next, and felt the color drain almost entirely from his already pale face. His confident posture deflated instantly and completely, his shoulders sagging visibly as recognition finally dawned upon him with sickening clarity, the kind of devastating realization that always seems to arrive far too late to undo any damage already firmly done. Students began pulling out their phones in an absolute frenzy now, no longer searching desperately for an embarrassing video to laugh about and share later, but instead now desperately searching for solid confirmation of exactly what Robert had just announced to the entire room. Search results loaded one after another, rapidly across glowing screens, revealing a genuinely staggering list of accomplishments that scrolled endlessly down phones, held tightly by trembling, disbelieving hands. National championship after national championship appeared steadily within the official records, each victory more prestigious and impressive than the last, spanning many years of total dominance across multiple weight divisions and competitive circuits nationwide. World Championship titles followed shortly after in the search results, documenting international tournaments where she had decisively defeated skilled competitors from countries scattered all around the entire globe, her name appearing again and again at the very top of every single bracket. An unbroken winning streak stretched impressively across more than an entire decade of fierce competition, a statistic so remarkable that sports journalists at the time had once openly struggled to find adequate words capable of properly describing her sustained, overwhelming dominance within the sport. Old articles from years past referred to her repeatedly, using terms like phenomenon and once-in-a-generation talent, praising openly a level of consistent skill that appeared only rarely across an entire athletic discipline, spanning many decades of competition. Derek stood frozen on the mat now, the full crushing weight of his mistake finally settling firmly over him, as he finally understood completely exactly who he had carelessly dragged onto this training floor for nothing more than cheap, momentary entertainment. He attempted weakly to salvage some small shred of his rapidly disappearing dignity, straightening his posture deliberately and forcing his unsteady voice to remain calm, despite the obvious tremor threatening to betray him completely in front of everyone watching. He insisted, somewhat weakly and unconvincingly, that the match should absolutely continue, that stopping things now would only make the entire embarrassing situation appear considerably worse than it had already become for him personally. For the very first time since entering this dojo earlier that evening, Maya spoke at proper length now, her voice calm and carefully measured, carrying just enough quiet, natural authority to silence the remaining nervous murmurs, still echoing throughout the room. She told him simply, without any trace of anger or satisfaction in her tone, that she had genuinely tried to walk away from this entire situation more than once tonight, that she had given him every reasonable opportunity to reconsider his actions before things had ever reached this particular point. The match resumed for its final, brief remaining stretch, and everything about Maya's overall demeanor shifted noticeably the moment she finally decided to stop holding back entirely against him. She no longer dodged or evaded with quiet, careful restraint, as she had throughout the earlier portion of their match, instead allowing the true, full depth of her extensive training to finally surface in movements that left absolutely no room remaining for any doubt about who truly controlled this entire exchange now. Every motion she made carried the unmistakable precision of someone who had spent an entire lifetime perfecting these exact techniques against opponents far more skilled and experienced than the man currently standing across from her on this particular mat. Derek found himself completely and utterly unable to respond in any meaningful way, his desperate attempts at defense crumbling almost instantly against an opponent clearly operating on an entirely different level of mastery altogether. The designated student referee, visibly shaken and uncomfortable by what he was personally witnessing unfold in front of him, stepped forward quickly and called an immediate end to the match before things could possibly escalate any further than they already painfully had. There was no taunting whatsoever from Maya in that moment, no gloating, no attempt made to further humiliate a man who had spent the better part of an entire hour mocking her relentlessly in front of his own gathered students. There was simply an enormous, completely undeniable gap in skill and experience that had been laid bare openly for an entire room of stunned witnesses to see clearly with their own eyes. What hurt Derek the absolute most in that particular moment was not the loss itself, not the growing bruises forming steadily along his ribs, or the deep ache slowly settling into his wounded pride. It was instead the slow, sinking realization that he had personally transformed himself into a public spectacle of his own careless making, now broadcast widely to dozens of phones that had carefully recorded every single humiliating second of his sudden and complete downfall. The dojo fell into a silence so complete and absolute that the faint hum of the fluorescent lighting overhead felt almost overwhelmingly loud against the heavy stillness now gripping the entire room around them. Nobody moved for several long, uncomfortable seconds, each person present processing what they had just witnessed unfold in front of their own disbelieving eyes. Derek eventually broke that heavy silence himself, his voice now quiet and completely stripped of the arrogance that had clearly defined him just moments earlier, offering a sincere public apology in front of everyone, still gathered closely around the mat. He admitted plainly, without offering any excuse whatsoever, that he had judged Maya entirely based on her outward appearance alone, assuming weakness where there had actually only ever been quiet, deeply controlled strength, hidden carefully beneath the surface. One by one, the students who had laughed along and cheered and recorded videos purely for entertainment began approaching Maya quietly, offering their own sincere apologies for the casual mockery they had each participated in earlier that same evening. Maya accepted each individual apology graciously and without judgment, never once raising her voice in mockery or quiet satisfaction, never treating any single one of them with the same condescension she herself had received from the room only an hour earlier. She spoke briefly but meaningfully to the entire group gathered around her, sharing a simple philosophy that had clearly guided her steadily through every quiet, anonymous year since she had originally walked away from professional competition years before. She explained calmly that the strongest people rarely ever felt any genuine need to prove their strength loudly to others, that true confidence existed quietly within a person, without ever requiring an audience or applause to properly validate it. She told them gently that respect should always come before talent is ever fully revealed to anyone, that judging another person based on appearance alone would almost always eventually lead to exactly the same kind of painful regret. She reminded them softly that assumptions made carelessly from prejudice or quick first impressions would almost always crumble. Eventually, the moment reality finally stepped onto the mat in front of everyone watching. The students listened closely, several of them nodding slowly, clearly absorbing a lesson that no textbook or lecture could have ever taught them quite as effectively as tonight's events had. News of what happened inside that small dojo spread rapidly across the internet within just a few days, the recorded footage circulating widely among martial arts communities and casual viewers alike, who could hardly believe what they were personally watching unfold on their screens. The video amassed millions of views within a remarkably short period of time, drawing extensive commentary from professional fighters, respected coaches, and sports journalists who immediately recognized exactly who Maya Johnson truly was and what her sudden reappearance actually meant. Numerous companies and major media outlets reached out to her afterward, offering lucrative sponsorship deals, exclusive interview opportunities, and various partnerships hoping to capitalize quickly on her sudden, unexpected return to public attention. Maya declined every single offer that arrived at her door, choosing instead to remain exactly as private and grounded as she had always been before this entire incident had ever occurred in the first place. Reporters attempted repeatedly to track down her current address, her current workplace, anyone willing to speak publicly about her quiet life since retirement, but Maya consistently refused every single request for comment or further publicity. She wanted nothing from this sudden attention, except perhaps the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her old skills, carefully built over so many difficult years, had not faded away entirely, despite her long absence from the competitive spotlight. Weeks later, on an otherwise ordinary morning, Maya walked back through the doors of that same dojo once again, carrying her gym bag, just as she had during that very first time anyone there had ever seen her enter the building. This time, however, she had not come seeking competition, had not come looking for anything resembling validation or attention from anyone currently inside the building, waiting for her arrival. She had come simply to teach, offering her considerable time and knowledge freely to anyone genuinely interested in learning real discipline, patience, and mutual respect, rather than empty showmanship designed purely for an impressed audience. When she stepped through that same familiar door this particular time, every single person currently inside the dojo rose immediately to their feet without any hesitation whatsoever, without any prompting needed from anyone standing around them. It was not fear that moved them collectively this time, not the kind of nervous, uncertain tension that had originally filled the room before her true identity had ever been fully revealed to everyone present. It was instead genuine, completely earned respect, offered freely and willingly to a woman who had proven, through quiet patience rather than aggressive public display, exactly why true legends rarely ever needed to announce themselves loudly to anyone at all. Derek stood quietly among them now, his posture humbled noticeably in a way it had genuinely never been before in his entire career. Watching closely as the woman he had once carelessly dismissed stepped confidently onto the very same mat he had long considered entirely his own personal domain. He approached her slowly that morning, waiting patiently until she had finished setting up for her first class, and asked quietly whether she might consider training alongside him occasionally, not as rivals competing against each other, but simply as two dedicated practitioners willing to learn honestly from one another, going forward. Maya considered his request carefully for a long moment, studying his face for any remaining trace of the arrogance that had once defined him so completely, before finally nodding slowly, in quiet, measured agreement. It would take considerable time, she knew, for him to truly internalize the lesson this entire experience had taught him so painfully in front of his own students, but the first necessary step toward genuine change had clearly already been taken that morning. As Maya began guiding her very first group of new students through their opening stances that particular morning, correcting small mistakes patiently and offering quiet words of encouragement along the way, the entire dojo felt noticeably different somehow than it ever had before. It felt quieter now, more honest, built increasingly on something far sturdier and more meaningful than mere trophies or reputation alone could ever have properly provided to anyone training within its walls. Word continued spreading slowly throughout the local community about the dojo's new volunteer instructor, and soon parents began bringing their own children, specifically hoping they might learn directly from the woman whose quiet humility had become just as remarkable as her staggering athletic accomplishments. Maya never spoke much about her championship years unless a student specifically asked her directly, and even then she offered only brief, modest answers before quickly redirecting the conversation back toward whatever technique they happened to be practicing together that day. She understood deeply, perhaps better than anyone else present, that true mastery was never about commanding attention or demanding recognition from others, but rather about consistently showing up, training diligently, and treating every single person who walked through that door with the same quiet respect, regardless of their outward appearance or apparent skill level. The lesson Derek had learned so painfully and publicly that one unforgettable evening rippled outward steadily through his entire dojo over the following months, slowly reshaping not just how he personally treated newcomers, but how every student under his guidance eventually learned to treat one another as well. Years of unchecked assumptions and casual prejudice could not be undone overnight by any single embarrassing match. But something had undeniably shifted that evening inside those four familiar walls, something that continued growing steadily stronger with each passing week that Maya quietly returned to teach. She never sought out the spotlight again. After that single viral moment of recognition, never gave another interview, never accepted another sponsorship deal, no matter how generous the offer became over time. She had already learned, long before that fateful evening even occurred, that genuine respect could never properly be demanded from anyone through forceful intimidation or aggressive displays of dominance. It could only ever be earned slowly and patiently, through countless quiet acts of consistent skill, unwavering humility, and genuine kindness extended steadily and reliably over considerable time toward anyone willing to actually pay close attention to such things. Months later, a local newspaper writer named Patricia Owens approached Maya with a final, gentle request, hoping she might finally agree to tell her own story in her own words, rather than letting strangers continue to speculate endlessly about who she really was and why she had vanished from the public eye for so long. Maya thought about the offer for several days before finally agreeing to a short conversation, not because she wanted recognition, but because she realized her silence had allowed people to imagine versions of her story that were never quite accurate. She spoke honestly about her childhood, about Walter Briggs, and the cramped community center that had given her a path forward when so many doors around her had remained firmly closed. She spoke about the years of relentless training, about the loneliness of competing at the highest level, and about the grief that had eventually pulled her away from a sport she had once loved more than almost anything else in her life. She also spoke, briefly and without bitterness, about that single evening inside Derek's dojo, explaining that she held no anger toward him or toward anyone else who had laughed before truly knowing her. She said that being underestimated had followed her through nearly every chapter of her life, long before any championship belt had ever been placed around her waist, and that she had stopped expecting the world to recognize her value before she had a chance to demonstrate it herself. The article that followed avoided sensational language entirely, focusing instead on her discipline, her humility, and the quiet dignity with which she had handled an experience that could easily have turned bitter or resentful in someone with a different temperament. Readers responded warmly, many sharing their own stories of being judged unfairly because of how they looked, where they came from, or what assumptions strangers had carelessly made about their abilities. Derek read that same article twice, sitting alone in his office late one evening, long after his students had gone home for the night, reflecting quietly on how close he had come to losing something far more valuable than a single sparring match. He realized that the version of himself who had mocked a stranger for entertainment was not someone he wanted his own students to inherit or imitate going forward. Slowly, deliberately, he began changing the way his dojo welcomed newcomers, instructing his staff to treat every person who walked through that door with patience and curiosity, rather than quick judgment based on appearance alone. He posted a simple handwritten sign near the entrance, visible to everyone who entered, reminding both students and visitors that true skill rarely needed to announce itself loudly before earning genuine respect. Maya continued teaching at the dojo twice a week, never charging a single dollar for her time, content simply to watch new students grow more confident and more disciplined under her quiet guidance. She often arrived early, before anyone else, sweeping the mats herself and adjusting the lighting just slightly, finding a strange comfort in these small, ordinary rituals that asked nothing of her except presence and care. Children who trained under her rarely knew at first that she had once stood atop podiums in front of roaring international crowds, and she preferred it that way, allowing them to know her first as a patient teacher, rather than as a distant legend. Only later, usually by accident, would they discover old photographs or articles online, and even then, her reaction remained the same calm, modest acknowledgement she had always offered. One afternoon, a young girl named Destiny Carter approached Maya nervously after class, admitting quietly that other children at her school often mocked her for being quiet and different, who much the way Maya herself had once been mocked, decades earlier, in a neighborhood very far away from this one. Maya knelt down to meet the girl's eyes directly and told her gently that the quiet ones often grew into the strongest people in any room, provided they never let cruelty convince them to shrink themselves smaller than they truly were. She told Destiny that strength built quietly, away from applause and attention, almost always outlasted strength built loudly, for an audience that would eventually grow bored and move on to something else. Destiny returned to class the following week with a new kind of focus in her eyes, and Maya recognized something familiar stirring there, a quiet fire she understood completely from her own childhood years before. As seasons changed and the dojo settled into its new rhythm, the story of that one unforgettable evening slowly faded from urgent online conversation, replaced eventually by newer stories and newer distractions competing for attention elsewhere. But inside those four walls, the lesson remained firmly embedded, repeated quietly through every new class, every new student, every small moment where assumptions threatened to creep back in before being gently corrected. And so, in that small, unremarkable dojo, tucked quietly away in an unremarkable corner of an unfamiliar city, a woman who had once been underestimated completely by an entire room full of confident strangers slowly became the very same quiet heart that held the entire place steadily together going forward, one humble lesson and one patient class at a time.